Okay, welcome aboard. We're here in Radio 2RPH. Today we're taking you through a little tour of the radio station, inside the workings of this station, and you'll get to see announcers reading on air. We're going to chat to some of the staff, and we're also going to go behind the scenes and have a look a little bit at the office side of things and the running of a radio station like this. So let's go on our tour. So Nikki, tell us about 2RPH and your role here and what you have to do on a daily basis to keep a station like this on the air.
Oh, that's a very big question. I'm the manager of 2RPH, general manager, so basically the buck stops with me. I have to look after primarily the volunteers and their welfare and make sure they're here at the time that they're supposed to be here, and everything else that comes as part of the package of running a radio station. Some technical issues. I have a colleague who is responsible, has overall responsibility, but of course I have to be involved with all the technical questions and things that arise. I do auditions as we're doing today, and I also have to look after promotional aspects and a general day-to-day budgeting and all that kind of organisational thing that management involves.
And budgeting for a radio station like this, I mean, you're broadcasting on AM, FM, digital, online. It comes at a huge cost.
It does, and funding is always a problem. Every not-for-profit will tell you the same thing, I'm sure. And we do have both federal and state funding, but it's never enough, and hence 2 full-time staff, 1 part-timer, and you'll be meeting Chris shortly, our part-timer. And of course, it's a huge undertaking for such a small staff. So we end up doing very long days and having huge responsibilities with 200 volunteers, you can imagine. I mean, from ordering the toilet rolls to doing grant applications to the whole bit.
Where do you get your funding from apart from the governments? Do people leave money to you?
We have bequests, yes. We have memberships, so anyone out there interested in becoming a member of 2RPH, contributions always gladly received. Donations, we have some sponsored programs, and we have fundraising, which of course is very hard work and doesn't bring an enormous response.
So tell us about the licensing of a station like this. I mean, the cost to run it would be far more exceeded with this station, considering the amount of technology you're using on air, as opposed to, say, other community stations. So can you fill us in a bit on that?
Because we have 3 transmitters, yes. Yeah. Although we hold a community licence with the ACMA, we're actually probably more than a community, in the normal sense of a community radio station, which is usually prescribed by geography. We actually broadcast to, I don't know what percentage, it will be a large percentage of the eastern seaboard of New South Wales. We have our transmitter for Newcastle and the Lower Hunter up in on Mount Sugarloaf up in the Central Coast. Then we have our 2 transmitters for Sydney, one in Prospect, out sort of in the western suburbs, and then we have one in the eastern suburbs, the FM transmitter, which is at King's Cross. And of course, it's enormously expensive to run those transmitters.
So the licensing of a station like this, you don't play music. Is it a special license? Do you have to be 24 hours a day reading? It's not so much the licensing, the ACMA licensing. It's more other legislation that we're under, including RPH Australia. We're one of 7 radio stations that come under the auspices of the umbrella organisation, RPH Australia, Radio for the Print Handicapped Australia. And they have what we call a protocol, which is, it's not legislative, but it governs to a very great degree what we are allowed to put to air. And it is, yes, as you rightly say, Ben, it's reading newspapers, books, magazines for people who have difficulties accessing print, and it can be any kind of disability. It can also be what we call our eyes busy community, people who just
are working, or driving, or at home busily doing stuff and don't have time to pick up a newspaper or a magazine and read it. So yes, 16 and a half hours a day, and we have the BBC overnight, 16 and a half hours a day of pure RPH material. We have one or two exceptions to that, but on the whole, it's all reading, and we have to read each article in full and quote the page number and the byline, etc.
In the world that we're living in now, like initially 2RPH, when it went to air, served a very big purpose. You know, it had a mandate that it was looking after the print handicap. Do you think people in today's world like to be labelled with the word handicap? Like you talk about the eyes busy community.
It's good question. We don't use the word handicap. That's definitely a no-no. We use the word print impaired or vision impaired or print disabled, if anything. But we don't actually use it on air. We never say radio for the print handicap. We say RPH, which is fine. It's good enough. I think there is some resistance from people with print impairment to being labelled, which I suppose is understandable. But we found through surveys and also through just general interaction with our audience that we do have an enormous audience who are just who what we call eyes busy. It's just an RPH term, really. Just people, as I described earlier, who are busy.
Now, in the world that we're living in today, we're also competing against the busy world of social media, and the print world is having a massive impact with this. How does this radio station compete against all that oncoming technology in a world that's changing so quickly?
Well, that's our biggest challenge. You've put it in a nutshell. And it's something we need to be the board of directors and myself and the staff need to be looking very carefully at, and how we move with the times, how we develop the radio station to still be relevant in this very different media world. I mean, it's very different from the early 80s when the radio station first came to air. And programming is being looked at very carefully, and it's very challenging and very interesting. It's a very interesting time to be involved with this radio station.
So, in terms of programming, how many different forms of programming go to air across a week? You have magazines and newspapers, so how many different programs are we talking here?
Well, we read the daily newspapers every day. The Telegraph, the Australian, the Sydney Morning Herald. We don't read the Australian Financial Review in full. We have articles from the Australian Financial Review in our Features Forum program and throughout the week. So we have all those, and the Newcastle Herald, of course, for our Newcastle and Lower Hunter listeners. We also have, I think it's roughly 37, between 37, 30 and 40 magazine programs, newly minted every week, and it's every kind of magazine, from Woman's Day to New Scientist to the Monthly to various, cooking magazines. We have programs about pets. We have programs about science. We have a program called Focus, which is about technology. We have literally it appeals to, hopefully, to every walk of life, to every age group. We have programs for children, we have programs for young people, and we have programs like The Senior. The program's called Golden Generation, when we read The Senior for our older population. So hopefully we cover everybody.
And here's Ron with the first item.
And the first item is reported by Anthony Clan. New South Wales Government has moved to protect another 1 million hectares of prime agricultural land.
Page here, so we cut that out.
Well, first of all, everything has to be cut out.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, if you're on camera and you're sort of rustling the papers, it's not a good idea. And so each item is cut out, and then we just sort of handle the item itself.
But also, so the people listening, who might be TESOL students or all sorts of things, we've got to tell them exactly what page it's on.
Page it's on.
Yeah, and the date, of course.
Yes, which of course leaves them with a lot of instant reading to do, because the page is rather large, and we don't actually say it to the top of the page, or the bottom of the page, or anything like that.
How many hours a week am I have to give? And
Possibly 3 hours per fortnight, I think, or maybe 5 hours per.
Can you open that? If you're thinking of becoming a volunteer.
Oh, you need first of all to have an audition.
Yeah.
And that is to see whether you understand how to speak properly and whether you pronounce words correctly. Actually, quite a lot of people don't. And just generally have a voice that can be listened to with clarity and sympathy.
Okay, so inside the running of the office of a radio station like this, we're chatting with Chris, the project officer. Tell us, Chris, what does your job entail in this radio station?
Well, Ben, briefly my job entails raising awareness and funds for 2RPH, and I started here as the project officer in November of last year. And in that time we've tried to raise profile, particularly in the north, so we've called it our Northern Outreach Program, so that's Newcastle, the Lower Hunter and the Central Coast, focusing on getting community groups and government organisations from that area involved with the station, and that means obviously going to Newcastle, going to Central Coast and the Hunter, and then also approaching funding bodies, so that could be government or other. So yeah, that's primarily my
So
role.
when we're looking at funding, I mean, the world that we're living in, funding is getting harder and harder. How do you sell something like this to get funding?
That is really difficult, and as you said, it is harder and harder to get the funding dollar, so we have to really rely on the fact that we are unique. This is a unique service. There is no other service like 2RPH, and I think that is not just a hook, that really is the good thing about us. We are a reading service, so we provide this to whatever the print disabled community might mean, as Nikki mentioned, the eyes busy community, people who have a print disability, which means they may be are unable to actually read and or hold papers and magazines and books, so it could be anything and everything. So,
Do you relay the stories of, say, your listeners when you're upselling something like this? Do you profile those types of people?
yes, we certainly like to sort of give a lived experience so people get an understanding. We speak at organisations, as I mentioned, like Lions clubs and regional libraries, and so we like to give people a picture of who our listener base actually is, so they get a better idea. So in having to look at a broad brief, and that we're not just for traditionally visually impaired people, it's actually widening that scope, and it's making people understand that we're not just for the vision impaired community.
Now, you're also working in this whole new world of social media. The radio station can run advertising, so is advertising a revenue stream that you look at, or is it hard to sell in a place like this?
Look, it is absolutely something that we try and do, so sponsorship dollars rather than actually calling it advertising. But yes, it is harder, but it is something that we definitely do, and we do have sponsors, so yes, advertising and sponsor programs.
So how do you keep up to date with this social media stuff? I mean, it moves pretty quickly.
It does.
So does your audience engage with social media, or is it an audience that's growing to learn about social media?
I'd say audience growing to learn. So we do have a Facebook page which gets lots of hits, and definitely whenever we put something up on Facebook, they actually do respond. We also have a Twitter page as of this year, so that's getting more and more traction, and we tend to obviously engage with the Twitter community by retweeting or mentioning, you know, if something particular is happening, if we're going to an event or something special that's happening at the radio station.
With the cooperation of the publishers, your radio reading service, 2RPH, brings you the Sydney Morning Herald. Here's today's presentation team.
Well, there you go. What an interesting insight into a world that, well, was created for a niche market. Hard to believe that 30 years plus later it's still going. How does a radio station like this, though, survive in a world that's constantly changing with the new advent of social media, but also the online platform? And at TAFE, you know, we're dealing with online radio. That is the future of radio. So, you know, when you look at a radio station like this, has it served its purpose? Is its purpose still yet to be served? And where is it going to be providing its service now and in the future? The answer basically lies in technology, and the future is probably in your hands if you're watching this today.
You're listening to 2RPH, your radio reading service.